Okay, well, welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us today. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen so we can get started. And we are here today mostly to talk about COVES principles and values. I've labeled it instrument and values for a few reasons, but over the last few weeks, we've talked a lot about using COVES and data in general to support reopening conversations, informed decision-making related to visitor experiences, in this case, related to perceptions of health and safety. Our general understanding of measurement COVES principles hasn't fundamentally changed since we formally began collecting data in 2016, but I would argue that more has happened in the last year than any other year in recent memory, which just makes us say, wow, this is a great time for reflection. Many of you also know that we have just wrapped our series of virtual convenings focused on integrating art museums into COVES more fully. And that has also raised a lot of new questions for us. And so we thought this was a great opportunity for us to just bring back to the COVES community some of the values that we built the system on, have a conversation, and basically ask a few simple questions built on something that's not so simple, which is, what is critical for our success over time? Are there things here, things about COVES, our system, our measurement, that we want to reconsider or question a little more deeply right now? And is there anything we need to add, if anything? And so that's what we're going to throw back to you towards the end of this short presentation, and we'll head into breakout groups if we need to, depending on the number of people who are interested in participating after some discussion. So I'll go ahead and continue now. This is going to be very familiar to most of you. At least I hope it is. I hope you're actually sick and tired of this spiel, because it should be second nature at this point based on your participation in COVES. But this is a slogan we like to talk about. COVES is designed to unite museums in systematically collecting audience level data with a focus on institutional and field-wide improvement. We still believe this to be true. We also believe that another way of saying that is we provide common language through data to help with decision making. So that common language means that the data that we use to discuss the visitor experience is the same. We can trust it, and we know that it's comparable across our organizations because of the way the system was developed. In order to do that, we relied on several core principles and values, which we're going to review together. I've consolidated them into 8 slides, but obviously there's many more or little details we could get into if necessary. But I'm going to start with these 8 things that we think are really important as far as principles and values that COVES holds and pushes forward every training we do, every year that we produce an aggregate report. And it starts with a system of shared ownership and trust. So several of you were involved in the COVES convening. I think it was in 2014, actually. That's how long ago we've been working on this. And one of the primary outcomes was we needed to have a system of shared ownership and trust, which means that the data we collect are useful. We are focused very purposefully on evaluation capacity building. So it's not just about the data, it's about strengthening our ability to use the data, converse with the data, interpret the data. And it's led by 2 groups that are very transparent in their operations. One is the questions and measures team, which is a small group that's focused on the COVES survey instrument in terms of what we ask our visitors, how we ask our visitors, and also conducts an annual review to make sure that it's still what we believe to be true. And then the Leadership Advisory Committee, which is designed to include new voices, develop expertise, and make sure that many of the member organizations are participating in guiding us forward year after year. In addition to the system of shared ownership and trust, we put pride in the fact that we have been doing this since 2014 when the COVES convening happened, and we've been collecting data since 2016, but that we took years developing this system, piloting different methodologies, testing the instrument after a thorough crosswalk of all of the visitor experience studies we could get our hands on, vetting the instrument itself by museum professionals to establish face validity, and ensuring that we had quality data that we could reliably use to have these conversations, both in the community and at our organizations. Again, that idea that we're trying to improve not just our institutions, but the field at large. We also believe, and this is I'd say a core principle, because there's a stake in the ground here that we believe that in order to understand the visitor experience at any museum, you need to know in 4 general categories: who is visiting, why they visit, what they see and do, and how they feel about that experience. And there are many specific questions we ask our visitors related to these 4 things, but over time, we still believe these 4 to be extremely true, with the understanding that flexibility is critical to push our understanding forward at any museum, right? So the most obvious example right now, we have data that respond to changing circumstances. We have a set of COVID questions that are in there about perceptions of health and safety before the visit, during the visit, visitors' willingness to touch exhibits that are hands-on in nature, and provide feedback around those perceptions of health and safety. We also know that flexibility related to our institutional or strategic initiatives is critical. Anytime we're working with the stakeholders internally, we need to be able to ask a few questions that are specific to our organizations and no one else's. And that includes things like logistical priorities that may not be into those 4 categories: who is visiting, why, what they experience, and how they feel, but is still really important for us to understand. And this is all critical, again, when we talked about that common language of data, because we have established a system that enables comparison. So here there are 4 avenues of comparison, if you will. One is comparison to self over time. So I've got the Museum of Science logo that is currently used, and then the very old Museum of Science logo from who knows when in a calendar, because I can now track the visitor experiences internally and compare myself to myself over time. More than that, we designed most of the demographic questions to reflect those that are asked on the US Census, so I can compare my audience, my visiting sample, to local or geographically specific data points that I can get my hands on, readily available. Third, we now have more than 30 museums participating, so I can compare the Museum of Science data to everyone who's also asking these questions of their visitors, the COVES sample. Or the 4th dark blue arrow at the bottom, I can compare my COVES data to a subset if I'm thinking specifically of maybe large urban science centers as just one example. So all of those questions that we talked about earlier about, who is visiting, why they come, what they see and do, how they feel about the experience, are important to facilitate comparison in these ways. And then there are 3 tenets. I think the word we've been using is tenet recently, which have helped us shape the instrument and our conversation around aspects of measuring the visitor experience over time. One is the importance of social inclusion. So we want our visitors to be able to see themselves in the questions that we ask, so that they know or they can feel like they are included in our measurement. Examples of this include non-binary gender response options, a question about LGBT plus status, as well as permanent or temporary disabilities. And if they select yes, they then have the option to tell us more about their perceived permanent or temporary disability. But we also believe in the importance of anonymity. So we collect no personally identifiable information, which means that visitors should feel comfortable telling us all these pieces of information, knowing that we're not tracking them specifically, but we are tracking our visitors in the aggregate, or maybe disaggregated, but not specific to people, just groups that visit. Examples of ways we include or embed aspects of anonymity into our measurement include prefer not to say response options for many questions, most of which are perceived to be potentially sensitive in nature. We only request rather than require responses. So in theory, someone could skip every single question on the COVES survey and complete it. We also, as mentioned, no personally identifiable information means no individual identification. I think that part was obvious. And then the last part, which we know pertains to our institutional review board as well, is no data collection from visitors under 18. We're not asking for consent for minors to participate. This is from adults who can respond at the group level. And finally, one of the biggest things, and I think this segues nicely into the conversation we're about to have, which is modifications over time. So one of the things that's really nice about doing a longitudinal study like this, the O in COVES for ongoing, is that we started with a very good system. We believe that. But we've needed to make improvements over time to make it better, because it's not perfect. I argue it's not perfect right now, and we still have room for improvement. So we believe that anytime there is an opportunity to change the system, whether it's a specific phrase or question or aspect of the system that can make everyone's visitor experience study better, we will seize that opportunity. And we've got several examples here that are specific to questions on the core instrument, the overall experience rating, 5-point scale, poor, fair, good, excellent, and then a point above excellent, which used to read superior. We changed that to read outstanding now, so that it wasn't had no connotations of white supremacy or superiority or things that have been talked about very publicly most recently. Another example of asking if visitors identify as Latino, we switched that then to Latinx, and now to be as inclusive as possible, we actually have this version that's Latino, Latina, Latinx. And finally, again, that idea that we don't believe every single response option is included on our survey. So there's almost always an another category response option with then the opportunity for visitors to tell us more about themselves. We changed the phrasing to read prefer to self-describe, so the piece of another that says other is not actually presented to people to make them feel othered. We continue to push this idea forward that we can always improve our system of questions that will improve our understanding of our visitors. And that's kind of the moment we're at right now, asking ourselves, are we still doing justice to this system, the way we ask questions, and the guiding principles that move us all forward? So just as a closing slide, for those of you who are either new to the community, or maybe it's been a while, there are several key resources that we believe push some of these ideas forward. The one at the bottom, the COVES white paper, was a direct product from our earliest IMLS grant. It's available on informalscience.org. And then the rest are available on our website, including the COVES Instrument Explained, which continues to be updated every time we make changes, and our most recent aggregate reports. Obviously, we're working on, we will be working on a new aggregate report soon once we understand how we can best consolidate data across this very crazy year in multiple methods. So after all those words, I'm going to stop sharing for a little bit. I'm going to open the floor to some of my colleagues to pose some questions and get us thinking about how we can transition into smaller conversations around this idea. So Sarah and or Alex or Gabby, if you have some thoughts, that would be great.
Sure. So I am thinking, because there are 37 of us on here, that it will make sense for us to shift into breakout rooms to hear from more people. But before we move into breakout rooms to really talk about the questions that Alex shared in the calendar invitation and the notes for this call, I'm wondering if folks have questions about anything that Ryan just walked through, that Ryan just shared. And feel free to post it in chat or come off mute and share verbally. Well, it looks like a lot of people are looking at perhaps their keyboards or different parts of their screens, but I think that was a full minute. Rachel was teaching me last month how to really wait it out. So yes, Ryan, I think that'd be great to share all of that. So what we'll do now, which is also how we had intended the timing of 20 minutes, 20 minutes, 20 minutes, is we will move into breakout rooms. And what we would love for you all to do is to introduce yourselves, share your name, your institution, your preferred pronouns, and the length of time that you've been a part of COVES, just so we have a sense of who's in the room. And then we'll spend, about 10 minutes per question, and I can copy them into the chat, that Alex shared in the prompt for today's call. The first being, do the values that COVES was built upon, that Ryan just sort of walked through, still ring true for us today? Do they still Do they still resonate? Are they still accurate to the way that you understand and experience COVES? And then the second one is, what other values or principles do you see at play within COVES? What else do you see, feeding into the way that you think about it, you discuss it, you either go about collecting the data and analyzing it and discussing it with others, or another way, sort of what connects you or animates you as you participate in some aspect of COVES, whether it's at your own site or here together with us. So there will be a note taker in each room, and there are between, I think, 4 and 6 people per room, and we'll send you in there and we'll come back together in about 20 minutes to hear what each group talked about. Okay, maybe we'll have a fewer people because people seem to be disappearing as I say we're going to talk amongst ourselves. But we'll open rooms and we'll see you back here in 20 minutes. Ryan, go to room 4.
Okay, thanks. Hello.
Howdy, howdy.
Welcome, everyone. Let's see. Okay, great. So I will facilitate this small group conversation, and I'm going to take some notes on the side, if that's okay with everyone. Everything I note take will not be attributed to you personally, but will just be kind of group thought for us to share afterwards. Let's start with some introductions. Again, I think it's your name, your institution, your pronouns, preferred pronouns, and then the length of time you've been a part of COVES. And I'll throw it over to Gretchen, since she's in my top right.
My name is Gretchen Haupt. I use she, her, hers pronouns. I'm with the Science Museum of Minnesota, and I've had my fingers in COVES since it started as a data collector, but it's only been the past 4 to 6 months that I've been involved in the community of practice. So I've had lots of, right now, I'm sort of the manager of our questions on the surveys and that kind of facilitator person. So we have at the Science Museum, we have a very distributed set of people that make meaning of and use the data.
Hi, I'm Cecilia Clark. I'm from Children's Discovery Museum of San Jose, and I used she, her, and hers, and I've personally been involved with COVES. I got trained up to give the surveys in the museum a few years ago, and then I've been joining this group here for about a year now because I switched into a different role.
And I guess am I next? I'm Lisa Bush from Baylor's Mayborn Museum, and she and her. And let's see, we started COVES a while back. I honestly haven't done a lot with it. It's our visitor services manager has really headed that up. I have been on the floor giving the survey before COVID. And so I did get to participate in that. I have heard a lot of discussions, and I'm really interested in data. I'm the associate director of the museum, so I oversee the strategic planning and keeping our scoreboard for our strategic plan to cheer ourselves on. And so we are folding COVES into our 5 big ideas that we have here at the Mayborn. So.
I'm Megan Pratt with Pensacola Mess Hall in Pensacola, Florida. She, her pronouns. We've been involved for quite a while, but time has lost all meaning because it's like, well, it's been a year, so 3, 4, something, however long. So we were pretty early. We were one of the let's try out really small places that do not match the other museums. So that's where we fell in the rope. So.
Great, thank you all. And just to model, my name is Ryan Oster. I work at the Museum of Science. My title is Manager of COVES, so that's why I'm here. I use he, him pronouns, and I have literally been working on some aspect of CCOVES or COVES since I started work at the museum, which was 9 years ago. That's how long we've been doing it. getting the system up and running. So, so we've got 2 questions that we can focus on for the next 15 or 16 minutes. And we'll start with the first one, which is simply, do the values COVES was built upon still ring true today?
I would say yes. I mean, I have not, I admit, like I said in the beginning, have not been a great part of this, but I think for me, having that data is so valuable in making good informed decisions. And I think I have a daughter, this is a long story long, I have a daughter with special needs, and I have learned through behavioral therapy that there is a lot of, you think one way, and then you can look at the data and go, oh, maybe my thinking is wrong. So I think in a lot of ways, it really helps us still to kind of change our thinking on some things, which I think is an important thing that we need to be able to do. So anyway.
And I also think that the comparison is helpful too, because, you know, sometimes, I mean, we're small, we don't know what we're doing, and we get this data and it's like, okay, well, nobody else knows what they're doing on this either, or we can aspire to be more like these, but, you know, like what, you know, we have all these aspirations, and then I say, but Museum of Science Boston didn't solve it yet either. So
I'd like to highlight the value of like trustworthiness is something that I know we've done a lot of, I don't want to say training as in like, you know, to like the little people, but like as in training and supporting people in the organization to really trust the data that comes from COVES, so that it is sort of, it's very accepted, and it is it's not questioned, and people just very much take it at face value. So I think that like the importance of the trustworthiness is still very, very much valuable.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think in our organization, it's the first time that we've ever really had data in this way, in this kind of visitor experience way. I mean, before it was kind of somebody saying, oh, well, so many years ago we did a zip code survey, you know, or just kind of anecdotal that then becomes institutionalized. And there's a lot of that. And so I think this has helped kind of move us away from that, that tendency to just take what we think may be historical knowledge, but isn't necessarily based on data, and be able to have an unbiased set of data.
Wonderful. And then the meatier question I think that we can address now is, what other values or principles do you see at play within COVES?
Could you repeat that?
What other values or principles do you see at play within COVES? So was there anything that you think is really central to the work that we do, the way that the system operates, that was not mentioned in that discussion of what is central or foundational to COVES? Or has anything emerged over time that we need to add to our thinking to help push us forward?
Well, I think it was touched on in your presentation where you, and I'm not sure what category it came under, but the social justice component to it. And I think that being able to look at the demographic data to determine where the audience is coming from, versus where people think it's coming from, has been helpful. And, you know, for example, we live in a very diverse area, and our Latino audience, we had a Latino initiative very early on in the museum, but our Latino audience has shrunk, but nobody really could pinpoint that or be able to verify that, but COVES was able to document that for us and said, okay, well, what kind of access programs are we doing, and how else is this Latino initiative that we started still working, and what else can we do to increase that portion of our diversity efforts. And I wonder if as these issues continue to unfold across the country, and more policy gets more policy efforts and initiatives, and we start making greater strides in the country in terms of dealing with racism. I wonder, I just pose it as a question, how the tool might change to support or help identify those areas of weaknesses, but also maybe build a bank of knowledge that could then support what museums could do to affect change in that area.
One thing that sort of along the social justice, but in the reflecting that everyone could be identified. I've told Ryan this before, but it's always interesting for us to have to define for people, what does LGBTQ mean? Like, we have visitors who are like, so if I don't know what this is, I'm probably not it. And it's like, yeah, you're not it. You know, but just because, I mean, that's not, I mean, we're in a pretty conservative area. And so trying to just, I mean, it's almost an educational tool for people to think about where they fit, and that other people fit differently. I mean, we do get the people who are like, gender is not a salad bowl or something. I'm like, no, whatever, you know, but it is an interesting thing to reflect our values as a business, even though we don't have a gender exhibit or something.
Yeah.
Yeah, I know. We just had a discussion the other day of how we're folding COVES in with our strategic plan. And one of our 5 big ideas is to build relationships with communities who represent a diversity of backgrounds, ages, and cultures. And we have in here, some museums ask specific DEAI questions with their COVES data. So we were wanting to look at other museums' questions. And so we're going to be reaching out to y'all, Ryan, because we have that on our list. So I just, so I, again, haven't really been involved I feel enough to speak logically to answer your question, but I do feel like, that being able to track and monitor that, because again, sometimes we think we're meeting an audience that we are really targeting towards, and we can find out through the data that we're not. So, so I know that's important for us. I don't know if that really answers your question.
I will also say I like how with the dashboard you can even segment audiences further, because I think, you know, a lot of times you look at data and you're like, oh, well, racially we have this, but people are more than their race. And so I can look, okay, here's their race. How does that, you know, how does that racial group reflect? Like, going to your question about the Latino population, you know, maybe you used to have this one church that was really energized and now they aren't. And that could have, you know, and so what's that other, you know, portion of that person's identity that we missed?
Oh, I love that. Yeah.
It's something that's come up around, like, that we, you know, wrestle with when we start to disaggregate experience data, is that we're sort of at the mercy of people who choose to leave explicit comments about what's going on, especially when it's around their personal identities, not like their email and whatnot, but like their experience as a person of color or a LGBTQ person, that like when we see consistent differences in experience, and the way that their personal identity intersects with their identity as a person who comes to a science museum is, and I know that, you know, I'm speaking for myself. I don't know if I've heard a lot of these questions explicitly, but that we're looking into what makes a welcoming experience. And so we're looking into it because there doesn't really seem to be anything out there, but right now, but that because COVES is about the experience, is how does if some things come out of an open-ended response, but is the and the survey itself is a welcoming experience because it does include a lot of different ways to be seen, but it sometimes can be, I feel like it might be perceived as really just about the things that I could put my hands on or my interaction with a staff person, which that could be, but like how does the way the museum is presenting its content support, or how is that contributing to my experience and feeling welcome here?
It's a really good point, Gretchen, and you've hit something to me that is both obvious and intimidating, which is like some things are inherently very difficult to measure. You even mentioned that whole, the welcoming belonging thing, which is an entirely separate study just to figure out how we can measure that. And then if that takes that much effort to figure out how to ask those questions or measure the sense of welcoming or belonging, what else are we struggling to measure that matter towards the visitor experience that we can't even grapple with right now? And that's part of what wasn't included in the presentation, but we often remind people at that initial training, which is COVES is not the silver bullet. It's not going to be the one study that answers all your questions. And that's really hard to accept sometimes, right? Because we have a mechanism in place. We're surveying our visitors. We're surveying lots of our visitors, asking all these questions. We have a dashboard, and yet there's still things that we can't process or understand through this mechanism about their experience, and it's frustrating. But I think that's exactly why we're having this conversation. Where can we grow in the future? DEAI has been mentioned by virtually all of you in one way or another, and that intersects very closely with the sense of welcoming and belonging, how much that matters. We heard that abundantly clear from many of the COVES Art virtual convening museum colleagues we met with last month, and we're thinking about how that's going to build on COVES as we know it and where we're going to go. So that's all awesome. So we can keep riffing on this if we would like. There is a sub question that was built into this last conversation that we've just been having, but maybe there's more to add, maybe there's not. And that question is, what values or principles that we've already discussed animate or resonate with you as you work on COVES and participate in this community? You already mentioned a lot of them, which is why I'm wondering if we need to say it again. I heard, maybe it wasn't explicit in like the central principle, but we mentioned the dashboard. We mentioned appreciating that there are ways for visitors to see themselves. The comparative data aspects are important. Embedding it into the strategic plan. Lisa, I can't wait to hear how that develops, what you guys decide. And so, maybe that should be a smaller. There are a number of organizations who have embedded COVES data points into various aspects of strategic plans. So you could get some other ideas just from this community about ways they've been doing that. And I love this idea of being forward thinking about, how can we use COVES to push collectively on breaking down barriers of systemic racism? I mean, certainly it is linked to what we've already talked about, using the dashboard to better understand differing perceptions in our audiences. Thinking about welcoming or belonging and how we understand that in different ways, but definitely an area for us to push on.
Oh, very well summarized.
Nice.
I struggle with that because there's so many good ideas. Like, oh my gosh, how do we summarize?
I'm cheating because I'm taking notes, so that's part of it. But.
I will echo the comment earlier about trustworthiness, though. I think that does make me feel like I'm doing something that actually is legitimate, that, in the big picture will have the information, as opposed to other kinds of surveys where I'm like, wow, what would you like for the results to look like? And I sort of feel like there's actual science behind it as opposed to, touchy-feely, whatever I wanted to say.
And even trustworthiness in-house. So you have different areas of the museum that just by nature of our jobs see things differently. And so having this objective way to talk about what we're seeing versus what our visitors are saying has been really nice across the museum. So I think it's helped us to have more open dialogue internally. If that makes sense.
This is kind of off topic, or maybe it's not, but it's a self-serving question of how are people presenting the data with all the comments? Because I was going to present tomorrow at a meeting, and so I downloaded the dashboard, and then I downloaded as many of the comments as I could. Some of them didn't all come through, but some of them did in different areas of the dashboard. But now I have to wade through that, and it's a little overwhelming, but there's a lot of good stuff in those comments. I see we're running out of time. Oh, so, because so anybody have any recommendations?
I was going to say, you should definitely bring that to maybe like a written post in the community of practice. I'm sure there's lots of ideas. I know Gretchen's done some of that work. There's 2 ways that I can recommend very quickly. One, if you have lots of time or experience in-house, you can code them, maybe broadly positive, negative as a start, and then specific experiences or specific themes. So thematic coding, emergent coding. The second one, which is not to code at all, but just link the comments with 1 or 2 or 3 data points. Are they a member? Yes, no. What was their net promoter score or overall experience rating? Or in a third one. So you can say, this comment applies to this type of person, a promoter who's a member who lives locally, something like that. And you could do that with all of the open-ended comments.
It does generate some activity, doesn't it? So as I tell the little kids, he makes a lot of noise and roars a lot, but his feet are stuck to the ground.
He's looking in the wrong direction. So if you're just quiet and don't move, apparently, from Jurassic Park, I learned if you just don't move, you'll be fine.
So I think this is everyone. We did lose about 10 people or so when I said we're going into breakouts. That's okay. Thanks for my room for being willing to split up into other rooms. So in our last 17 minutes of this call, we'd just love to hear some crosstalk of the conversations we all had. Anyone itching to share what your group discussed? Either about whether these values and tenets still hold true, or other things that come up or come to mind as you think about COVES?
In our group, we talked a little bit about just the trustworthiness of the data, and all of the work that's been put into that has just been such a boon to have that in our back pockets when we're sharing this and trying to integrate it into the decision making and the work that we do, which leads into some of the other things that are like more DEAI focused.
Sarah, we spend a lot of our conversation talking about the second half of the question, the kind of other values and principles piece that we feel we sort of bring to it or see happen in our institution. And some of the things that came up there are really the internal buy-in that we work on, that COVES sort of launches as a conversation around how we ask questions, why we ask questions, and what that process looks like for our own institution and being part of something bigger than just one institution. We also talked about how it prompts conversations around what counts as valid data, and the different levels of data literacy among our colleagues, and sort of how COVES as a common language helps walk up to conversations about how comfortable we are with the data or how we react to data in a way that can be useful for the whole institution. And also talked about really the community that goes beyond not just specifically the instrument, but around our work more generally. And that there's value, the particular phase, there's a value that we have space for everyone's voices, especially in the last year through these calls and things like that, that there is that sort of iterative process or collaborative process that goes beyond the instrument itself. Something else that we talked about as other values or principles that we see inside of COVES but are hoping to be kind of pushed forward is especially thinking about COVES translating into multiple languages. And thinking about that translation process as more like a co-development process, understanding that as you move across languages, words and phrases have nuances, and that it's not just about translating specific, even just the questions, but even something like a consent statement. A literal translation of a consent statement can look or feel or read very differently. And being really, I loved that phrasing of co-development. You know, it's not just a kind of one-to-one ratio. And then also thinking about how that changes our practice on site, meaning data collectors that also reflect that variety of languages, that feel comfortable administering a survey that has that kind of variety and options to it. So a really fruitful conversation around like some of the practices that as the question was phrased, that we're bringing or we're animating through COVES, but are in those values you presented, Ryan, but maybe aren't as explicit as they feel sometimes on the ground in practice.
I like that idea, Rachel, of the stories animating the principles. So a couple of things that we talked about in our group were about the ways that we learn from each other, about how to do the evaluation capacity building, about how to talk about the rigorousness of the data. We talked about the role of this community shifting and changing as new organizations come in, and also new individuals at organizations that have been part of this for a while, and how that's an important part of helping this project be what it wants to be. And then we also talked about some variety of ways that, again, this one tool and all that surrounds it can contribute to big things that our museums want to do and want to be. So the ongoing question that many of you know we've been talking about for a long time about how people feel comfort or welcomed or accepted at museums, and how a survey can play a role in understanding that, and what our process would look like on that. And we also talked about how the features of the COVES instrument, continuous data coming in, same questions, comparability over time, comparability across organization, how that would benefit us to be able to have an instrument that we can use with people who aren't currently visiting. The idea that this is a really good tool for understanding who is coming, and often the tools we use to understand people who rarely or just don't come to our organizations, we're back to the, sort of, I write mine and you write yours world, or we use external consultants. And wouldn't it be powerful if we applied this model in that setting as well?
Marjorie, we had in our group, we had almost the same conversation. We talked about welcoming and trying to get at that, for people who are coming, but then also talked quite a bit about how do we get information about people who aren't coming and why they're not coming. And we actually were talking about, what about partnering with the kinds of groups that look at that, and having COVES in partnership with them to try to give like local information at the institution level, at the community level around our institutions, that could like somehow integrate or connect data about people who are coming with data about people who are not. So looking at, the culture track study that was just performed, and I guess it's ongoing, impacts research. Scott Corwin's organization, they do tons of data collection across the country around why people are not going to cultural organizations. And I know Jeff Hayward has done a lot of work in this area too. So there are people out there and organizations out there that are doing that kind of work, and could COVES somehow, partner with them? No idea what the business model would look like, but we were just beginning to think about that and talk about how that could work.
This came up a little bit in our group, and I invite anyone from group 2 to jump in to flesh this out as I look at our notes, but kind of in a different strain of thinking about both visitors and non-visitors, and understanding ways in which we might engage approaches that are friendlier. I think that was one of the words used, which I actually really like, that are friendlier to the communities we want to engage more fully. And that this might look like non-traditional or non-Western approaches to data collection and data gathering. And so again, a different track in some ways, but overlaps with both visitors and non-visitors. And that led us into a larger conversation about being very clear that COVES is not the be-all end-all for what your institution might need for critical decision making, but being just as clear about what it can do and where it fits with all of those other tactics, other methods, other approaches, and how to kind of see it in a fuller picture felt important in our group discussion. So not quite on the nose of that non-visitor question, but I think there's definitely overlap there.
This is so interesting. So I ended up joining Alex and Josh's group, and then Clarissa and Rebecca were in there too. And we started with, yes, these values, these principles still fit, but as we think more about social inclusion, and much of what we've talked about around all of this is sort of other elements of social inclusion. And sort of how we think about it. And so I'm just sort of spinning on, do we get a little bit more clear around this and saying this is how we think about it and what we do cover. Here's our aspirational self, and here's, as we continue to grow and evolve, what's on the 10+ year kind of horizon sort of thing. But it's just really interesting. Rachel, you're talking about translation and the need for different languages. It suggests something different as we do direct translation, and then this sense of friendliness and non-visitors. And Josh was talking about some of what he's been reading around all of that. And so I'm just thinking more around how do we, and all of the welcoming, belonging conversations we've had. Feels like there's a lot there that we can think about and expand into, or say, maybe not today or tomorrow.
Yeah, and I think it goes it goes beyond kind of welcoming and into some of the more like participatory museum stuff of like collaborative or co-creative design and development, where museums really partner with community members or community organizations to create their work. And it just strikes me that like we don't really ask anything on the COVES survey, even of the visitors who come, to what extent did you get to participate in developing anything that was at the museum today or something, like that. And that asking questions like that also can be like a lever to kind of nudge museums in that direction. It's like, it's that thing of like, what you don't measure doesn't happen. Isn't valued. And so, yeah, I just wonder about even asking museum visitors about that. And then there's, of course, looking at, as museums do more of that over time, seeing if seeing to the extent to which the visitorship shifts. I think that could be a really interesting kind of like research line for the next 5 or 10 years, because more and more museums are doing that kind of work.
Were there other big pieces or that came up in your conversations or that you're sitting chewing on right now?
I'll just throw out there one thing that I was thinking about but didn't kind of mention in the group because we were kind of in a different direction. But when Ryan was talking about standardization and comparison and flexibility, I think that the pandemic made me think much differently about flexibility. And I really had to grapple with that as a core tenet of COVES, or like the degree to which we balance standardization and flexibility and how we had to get so much more flexible. And I continue to sort of just be thinking about and rolling around in my head how we think about that moving forward and how that flexibility changes or what happens with it. So I something that's really on my mind, and if that will need to fundamentally change or what.
Alex, I brought up that same exact thing in our group too, about how I've seen COVES have this flexibility, and even though we have this, standardized measure, we're still flexible to what's happening in the world around us and responsive to that. Even those examples of how we've changed the wording of some of our questions to be more responsive and more inclusive, and that we continue to have that flexibility, I think is so important, because we could just be here's our measure and we're not changing it. We have this validity evidence and there we go. But I think this value that we do have this flexibility is so important to this work.
I'd also love to explore later, maybe not in the next 2 minutes, for those of you who are sort of on the newer side of being a part of COVES, what does it mean? What is this first one that I have in my list of shared ownership of the system? What does that mean for all of us in different ways? As Josh shared in our breakout, you're like, well, I'm a part of the leadership team, so I have this intimate knowledge of everything that's going on. Many of you, I'm looking at Lauren's face, attend these community practice calls every month, but what does it mean to have shared ownership of this? And do we need to continue exploring that to allow different ways of sort of fueling our system and making us reflect and shift things as we need to, or, having a sense of ownership and either, as Amy was just talking about, flexibility in your own instrument, or even more globally across COVES. So that's one question I have.
I'll unmute because you called me out.
Oh, I was just looking at you saying you're here every month. I love it. Yeah.
No, I've got a thing to say about in response, because it totally was something that we talked about quite a bit in our group. But I think, as someone who is pretty new to the group, that's been something that I find super, super valuable, is both the evaluation capacity building for myself in having access to peers and colleagues who know different things than me and can share that information with me, but also having kind of backup support from other people who are in this field in bringing that back to my team, because I'm the kind of first evaluator that they work with extensively, and having that rigor is really, really helpful. And having someone else say, yes, and we agree, and this is why, that's really helpful to have that backup too. So it's not so much ownership as it is kind of support, I think, for us at least.
I know we're at time, so I'm not going to belabor that point exactly, but one of the things that we tied to shared ownership was this idea that you can help shape the trajectory of COVES, of visitor experience evaluation for the field, of this line of questioning through conversations like this. So ownership doesn't mean like, it's mine, yeah, but it can mean I play a role in where we go next. And I think that's really important for this group and these monthly calls and everything that we kind of talk about over and over again, because it furthers the foundation on which we all operate, which I really appreciate as someone who is intimately involved in all those pieces. So, but since I did belabor the moment and it is past the hour, I'm going to cut us off and say, what a great conversation. Thank you all so much, especially to the moderators, facilitators who jumped on those breakout rooms. Thank you all, especially for the large group share outs. Thank you all for your voices. This recording will go to our YouTube page so other people can view it. So if you have others at your organization who want to learn about COVES core values, please recommend that. And otherwise, we will see you next month or sooner.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye, everyone.
Thanks all. Bye.
Hey, Ryan.
Hey, how's it going?
Good. Couple things.
Oh, yeah, shoot.
So I just noticed, and I'm not going to hold this against you guys. When I go to the Qualtrics page now, they have Tom Brady's face on there. And
I actually went to the work different session, and it was kind of humorous. I mean, Qualtrics has always had star speakers. I went to a conference once, and Michael Phelps was the headliner. So
wow.
yeah. Yep.